Game A40 here, doing a decoding of Bronze Age Pervert. Bronze Age Pervert venerates ancient Greece, where man-boy love was the thing, right? Not marriage, right? Bronze Age Pervert doesn't have much time for marriage, doesn't understand why men would want to waste their time around women. He generally doesn't find women objects of erotic attraction, but young men, that's where it's at. So in ancient Greece, the era that Bronze Age Pervert idealizes and venerates and worships, right? The highest form of love in ancient Greece was between men and boys. So Jerry Sandusky seems like perhaps an archetype for Bronze Age Pervert, right? Jerry Sandusky, great defensive coordinator, very hands-on, wanting to work with boys, very hands-on, cornholing boys in the shower. And that kind of man-boy love seems to be the energy that drives Bronze Age Pervert. Just idealizes, man-boy love. That's really where it's at, staying away from icky women. The other thing that seems to characterize him is that he's dropped his real-life identity, completely submerged himself into trying to make himself an online god and be worshipped online. He's dropped his real-life identity, just merged himself into this online persona. And like Leo Strauss and many Leo Strauss acolytes, Bronze Age Pervert believes that he has a secret decoder ring for understanding the ancient thinkers such as Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. So he did his PhD thesis on the problem of tyranny and philosophy in the thought of Plato and Nietzsche, and his dissertation advisor, Stephen Smith, said it was original perspective, but his original perspective purporting that he had the secret decoder ring for what Socrates really meant. So the Bronze Age Pervert holds that he knows what Plato really meant, that Plato purposefully made Socrates' anti-tyranny argument so weak that he must have intended that his audience side with the defense of tyranny. So Bronze Age Pervert thinks that Caligula is a heroic figure, that we should look to tyrants like Caligula as kind of the way forward. So like Mencius Moldbug and his veneration of monarchy. So Mencius Moldbug has no time for democracy, for messy relationships like that. He just wants a king to rule over us, right? It's a fantasy delusional world that unsurprisingly comes from people who spend a great deal of time online and very interested in creating their own online persona, more interested in creating online persona than real world corrections. So the bloke behind Bronze Age Pervert essentially gone silent in the real world since 2018, so he can devote himself to promoting homoerotic man-boy love as the highest ideal form of human interaction, and promoting the rule of tyrants and substituting for democratic rule the rule of military figures. So we discussed the Bronze Age Pervert on the book club that we did on my show once a week for about 2 years with Kevin Michael Grace. This is from my show, June 22, 2018.
3 p.m. Pacific time. And the book this week, it's a hard one to be indifferent about. If you pick this book up, I reckon you'll either love it or hate it. It's a book called The Bronze Age Mindset. And Kevin Michael Grace chose it. Kevin, why did you choose this book?
I thought it would be fun. I know very little about Bronze Age Pervert. I suspect that very few people do, and this is deliberate on his part. He calls his book a manifesto. Well, first of all, let me read something from a Vox article, and we all know about Vox, so, cum grano salis. Nobody knows who Bronze Age Pervert is, but among a subset of internet denizens, he's something of a demigod, a Jordan Peterson in miniature. He was well known enough for the neo-reactionary and proto-alt-right thinker Curtis Yarvin, better known by his pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, to name check.
And question in the chat, does 40 have an inspiring vision of the future? Is it just get married, have kids, and die? Yeah, I have an inspiring vision of the future, and that is today, your actions are in harmony, right? That you do the things that you want to do, you avoid doing the things that you don't want to do, that the different parts of your life work together, that you play an important role in the lives of people around you, that you are loved by people around you and you love them, and you live a life that's in harmony with your values. So you don't state certain values and then live a life completely contradictory, but instead your life, your actions, your beliefs, the various sectors of your life kind of all work together so that you can have the best possible relations with the people who are in your life. That's my heroic vision of the future, right? Where you do what you say what you do, you mean what you say what you mean, as appropriate to the context and the situation, and you're not doing things, in private. You'd be ashamed of being known publicly. That what you do in church and what you do in synagogue and what you do at the bar, what you do at a stadium, what you do with your friends, with your acquaintances, with your work colleagues, with people in various communities that you're a part of, that it all basically works together. So I have a vision of a harmonious life. And that vision contains 5 to 15 hours a week volunteering, helping out other people. So every day you should be doing things that you can feel good about, that are not just the selfish fulfillment of your own basic needs. That's my vision.
I'm in a recent interview with an Atlantic journalist telling Rosie Gray that Bronze Age Pervert was his contact inside the White House. Well, this seems to have been an attempt to troll Gray. It speaks to Bronze Age Pervert's relative notoriety within this tight community. Now, this writer does not know what notoriety means. Notoriety is a bad thing, not a good thing. And furthermore, it is clear from reading this book that...
So Kevin, Luke says that the life I describe is not really heroic. Well, to the people who are positively affected by what I'm doing, for the people for whom I play a role in helping them break out of deadly addictions and compulsions, for some of them, it's absolutely heroic. For people who need my help and I provide it, it's heroic. For the people who benefit from when I extend myself and commit myself to causes and volunteer opportunities and commitments, greater and above myself. Yeah, it's heroic that other people get to benefit. Sometimes, reasonably large number of people, 100, 200, 300 people get to benefit when I put their welfare ahead of my own for a few hours a week. So if you need people and people are there to help you out, most people find that verging on the heroic. When people look forward to seeing you, when you lift people up consistently, when you are overwhelmingly a source of joy rather than a source of aggravation and depression in people's life, and you're a source of joy because you have joy, yeah, people tend to find that really good, if not verging on the heroic, if you can bring that day in, day out. If you can be someone who's at ease with yourself, and therefore at ease with other people, at ease with reality, so that people find themselves relaxing when they're around you, when people find themselves letting their head down, where people feel like they can be open and honest around you, where they don't have to pretend, where they don't have to put on a persona, where they don't have to claim to be one thing when they're really something else. And that release of unnecessary tension and aggravation just unleashes joy and souls coming out of hiding. Yeah, many people find that heroic, rather than creating a fake online persona claiming that you have the secret decoder ring to the ancients, that the highest form of love is between men and boys, that we really need more tyrants like Caligula ruling over us. Yeah, I would say that I prefer my presentation of the heroic to the veneration of homoerotic love between men and boys as being greater than the love in a nuclear family. I would say that the veneration of tyrants like Caligula is an inferior version, an inferior vision to what I share on this channel.
He is not like Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is an Apollonian and Bronze Age Pervert is clearly a Dionysian.
And what are the main differences between Apollonian and Dionysian?
Well, to put it bluntly, Apollonian stands for order and Dionysian stands for disorder.
Yeah.
I mean, it's much more complicated than that. But one might say that an Apollonian is devoted to reason, whereas a Dionysian is devoted to passion. The most famous Dionysian of our age is Jim Morrison of the Doors. He's been celebrated for that by many people. There's a cult.
But 40, any inspiring vision for the future of humanity? Well, it helps if you pay your bills, if you have good relations with other people, you make consistent, solid, pro-social decisions to free up time in your life to then devote to poetry, to music, to thinking about society, politics, philosophy, art, all right? So if you are creating space for that in your life because of the positive choices that you make, because of the self-discipline that you show, because you set aside savings, because you choose to create time for yourself to explore ideas, to join communities, to build your relationships with other people who are similarly, inspired, or similarly want to guide humanity in a better direction. All right, then you can build on the positive choices. But if your personal life is a mess, if you're getting deeper and deeper into debt, if you rely upon welfare, if you're a sucker on, if you suck on the teat of your family or of your community or of your nation, right? I am highly skeptical of any contributions you're going to make towards the future of humanity. Possible, but first, as Jordan Peterson says, clean your room, get your own life clean, organized, lead a life that's in harmony, not at war. And out of that, out of the good connections that you build and a life that is interwoven with the lives of other people, you're far more likely to produce a vision for the future that is useful and accords with reality, rather than a delusional homoerotic worship me and suck me off vision let's venerate tyrants presented by Bronze Age Pervert, the Jerry Sandusky of the alt-right.
Around him because of that. Reading this book, I was struck by something that the great critic Lester Bangs once said to Cameron Crowe, that he asked him about what typewriter he used, and they were talking about writing, and Lester Bangs said something to the effect that he liked to take meth, and he'd just, type 25 pages, just to write, And it struck me that this book is not so much of a manifesto and more of a prose poem, or a fever dream, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many misspellings in the book that I assume that there's a point to them.
Well, I got the impression that this fellow is not a native English speaker. I also got the impression that he comes from the former Soviet Empire, either from Russia itself or from one of the countries of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the Slavic speakers have a big problem with the article. They will frequently not use the word "the" where it should be used.
Yeah, this is smart here from Kevin, deducing that Bronze Age Pervert came from Eastern Europe. He came from Romania, moved to the United States at age 10. So you can often tell a great deal about a guru, a thought leader, a live streamer by the quality of the people he attracts. And Bronze Age Pervert attracts this rabid audience that is highly reactive to the slightest criticism of their hero. So one of the signs that you're dealing with someone who's bad for you is if they cultivate this unnecessarily strong in-group, out-group identity, where the in-group is those who listen to them and worship them and follow them. And to the extent that I have a following, I would not want to have a rabid following, right? I would not want people wasting their energy defending me. I sometimes have good points to make. I often have daft points to make. I frequently have no points to make. And so too with anyone else who does what I do. Like, at times you're going to have a good point in a certain situation. You might have something useful, relevant, even cutting and incisive. Plenty of the time you'll be absolutely daft and wrong, and much of the time you'll just be mediocre. But there's this rabid in-group versus out-group mentality fostered by Bronze Age Pervert that highly reacts against the slightest criticism of their hero. I think that's unhealthy, along with this delusional idea that he's got the personal decoder ring to the ancients like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and the author of The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli. I think that's absurd.
And they will frequently insert "thes" where they should not be used. I mean, to a certain extent, his language, his written language, is highly stylized. But again, there are a great number of gross grammatical errors, which I suppose could be deliberate. But that would indicate a really high level of accomplishment to pull that sort of thing off over a 138-page book. And I will point out that the book is only 138 pages, well, at least in my ebook edition, but it is actually longer than that because there are very few paragraphs.
Yeah. How did you hear about Bronze Age Pervert in the first place? Do you remember?
I don't. He was one of those people who seemed to rise up in 2016, or at the same time Ricky Vaughn did. And that there was a cult that arose around him. That's really all I know about him.
That's a bad sign. All right, someone who comes online, stays anonymous, devotes themselves to building an online persona, inviting worship, very similar to Nick Fuentes and Richard Spencer. Someone who submerges their real self in an online persona, not a good sign.
And what did you think of the book?
Well, I think that it rather reminds me of the French novelist Louis Ferdinand Céline, whom he name checks in the text, although it's far more anarchic than Céline. There is a sort of a fury to it, to the narrative. And as well, as opposed.
And what's the basis of the fury? The basis of the fury is that this world has not accorded the author of Bronze Age mindset the respect and adulation and status that he feels like he deserves. He feels like he is a superior man, but in real life, he cannot be a superior man. In real life, he's an oddball. He's an eccentric who lacks normal, genuine human connections. And so out of this fury that he hasn't been accorded the proper veneration, status, respect, prestige that he feels he is rightly owed comes the furious output.
To Céline, a lot of it seems crazy or deliberately crazy, like he's attempting to troll us. For instance, there's a section of the book where he's talking about geographers lying to us, for instance.
And Luke Croft says Richard Spence was always open about his name and views. Was he open about how he welcomed people hailing him with, Hail Spencer or Seek Heil, right? I don't think he was quite open about how much he venerated the Nazi adulation that he received in private. He tried to keep that private. He tried to present a reasonable figure to the public, to the mainstream media in private. He lapped up as much Nazi adulation as he could whip up. Don't think he wanted to make public how he was sleeping with the girlfriends of his followers. Don't think he wanted to make public his extensive, drug and alcohol abuse. So I think there was a great deal of Richard Spencer's life that he tried to keep on the down low.
That the Earth is actually much smaller than we think it is. And I don't mean smaller in a metaphorical sense. I mean in a literal sense. Also that many cities in the world are actually the same. Now, this could be argued metaphorically, but the book...
And the chat says Richard Spencer admires Napoleon more than Hitler. At least that's what he says publicly. In his private life, he would take and whip up and seek out every bit of Hitler adulation as he could possibly receive. He deliberately took the alt-right, which was formerly known as a bunch of merry pranksters, and as closely as he could intertwined it with the Nazi outlook. And privately, he would, whip up storms of people seek-heiling him. That's what got him off.
Argues as if it were literal.
Do you think that Bronze Age Pervert is Mencius Moldbug?
Oh, I have no idea. I've read Moldbug, and I stopped reading him for this reason. I thought I'm a pretty clever fellow, but I have no idea what this guy's on about.
Yeah.
When I do figure out what Mencius Moldbug is on about, I realize he doesn't know nearly as much as he thinks he does. So Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, right, makes all sorts of grand pronouncements about topics he doesn't know very much about. I'm no scholar of World War II, but when he starts talking about World War II, I realize that he knows even less than I do. I realize that he knows even less than I do in all sorts of areas, and yet he feels completely confident making all sorts of grand sweeping pronouncements. So my experience of Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, is either I don't have a clue what he's talking about, it's just so abstruse and so poorly written, or when I do know what he's talking about, it doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny.
Dennis Dale, welcome to the show. Do you have any thoughts on the Bronze Age mindset?
Yeah, it was fun in parts. In parts not. Some of his arguments are brilliant, and sometimes it's just silly. That part about history, Kevin, and the geography thing. Yeah, it's weird. It just strikes me is that we have to learn how to read all over again, because people now will dip in and out of trolling and stuff, which is what I think this guy does here. Or he might just lead you into it. At some point, you're following along with him, and all of a sudden he's saying some crazy thing like, who knows, right? If Rio de Janeiro is not actually New York or some crazy stuff like this. But it's a lot of fun in his critique of, so-called scientism. It's the usual stuff, but it's very powerful.
I wanted to say something about, you mentioned history. He falls into the trap that Nietzsche did. Of course, you could look at this book as simply a gloss on Nietzsche, if you wanted to. This idea that there's no such thing as truth. Well, Roger Scruton pointed out that then this would obviously have to be true of the person who made the claim. And if any person makes such a claim, one should stop paying attention. He goes on at great length about how what we know, for instance, about the ancient world could have been cobbled together by later scribes, for instance, Christian scribes. But then he goes on to quote at great length about the ancient world.
Right.
And there's also, I don't know, that this confusion about ancient religion, about, for instance, Greek mythology. He weaves in and out of this, and this may be deliberate. One doesn't really know whether he believes that these gods are real or not.
Well, yeah, I'm not even certain of the level of his religious. He has religious sentiment. I don't feel like he has religious belief. He keeps pointing out the holes in.
A lot like Jordan Peterson. I mean, Jordan Peterson's an atheist who devotes himself to promoting Christianity, but he himself is absolutely bored silly participating in Christianity. And so Bronze Age Pervert likes to wrap himself in the mantle of religion when it's convenient, but I suspect he would be absolutely bored to death actually trying to live Christianity.
Logic, reason, the gaps that we all been talking about, we were talking about with the last book. But he doesn't really provide anything. He says, well, there's the Greek gods over there, and there's that tradition over there. Traditions you might as well trash, like the Christian tradition in another context, so.
He doesn't understand the Christian tradition at all. He talks about going to churches and being bored. Now, he makes a great deal in the book about sacrifice, and he evidently does not know, because it would appear he has no knowledge of the Catholic or Orthodox tradition, that Orthodox Christianity is based on a sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Mass, which Orthodox Christians, believe to be real.
Right.
Kevin, did you have further thoughts? Because you were just getting started there when
I interrupted.
No, you were interrupted by. So do you have further thoughts, Dennis?
Well, no, I mean, here's another thing. He talks about the hatred of beauty, which has existed through all time and space, apparently.
But remember, his beauty is boys, right? The greatest form of beauty for him is boys, young men, right? And the greatest form of love, as in ancient Egypt, and as in what Jerry Sandusky had, is the love and the eros between grown men and boys.
He doesn't seem to know about the Middle Ages then, because the Middle Ages, beauty was venerated. You have a situation where, say, the Vikings, my ancestors, the pirates that he so admires, were invited to take over Normandy, which they did, and in very short order were spending vast sums of money to build the most beautiful buildings the world has ever seen.
Yeah, this distinction he makes is not real between the pirate and the farmers. He has nothing but disdain for the mass. Where does he think this elite emerges from?
Well, sorry to interrupt, but one other thing in that respect. Now, he likes the Greeks a lot, the ancient Greeks, and he talks about wine and their use of wine, but wine is agricultural. Non-agricultural people have very primitive forms of alcohol. Wine is not a primitive form of alcohol.
Right.
Dennis, I want to get all of your thoughts on the book, so we're not going to interrupt you. Go ahead, Dennis.
Oh, no, I was just listening to Kevin. Kevin's got a lot better stuff than me.
Well, go on.
A lot of scattered notes.
Well, go ahead, give us your scattered notes.
Did you guys talk about the fact that Sailor, I found this old post from Sailor. Somebody found out that Steve Bannon was reading Moldbug, and Moldbug sort of rickrolled them. He directed them to Bronze Age Pervert. Yeah, and that might have been where that rumor started. But I also heard it might have been Jack Donovan. Is that the guy's name?
Yeah, that's his name.
Gay masculinist dude.
Yeah, Jack Donovan, leading homosexual in the alt-right.
But Bronze Age Pervert doesn't. Is this guy gay? I don't even know. I mean, everything about this is very gay in that theme, but he hates homosexuality, apparently.
Well, modern gayness.
Right.
I think he makes that quite clear.
Just effeminate gayness, and he has a very bizarre and I think just totally wrong theory about gay. This profusion of gay behavior now is a kind of reaction to our matriarchy, to this the owned space, he calls it, of matriarchy, and all these guys are guys that would be out conquering, but they're
Question why there's so many gay men in the distant right. One, you get to play dress up. Two, it doesn't matter that you don't have a nuclear family. All right, if you have a wife and you have kids, you're going to be far less likely to participate in dissident politics. But if you don't have a wife and a kid, you're going to be much more looking for excitement. So I get my excitement in large part doing live streams like this. I also delve into dissident politics. I have a much greater need for excitement than a guy who's married with a wife and kids. All right, if you're married with a wife and kids, you're not out there looking for excitement. You get pretty much all the excitement you need from your family.
And instead adopting this homosexuality. I don't buy that. I think a lot of these guys are adopting homosexuality because they're just quitting, because they can't keep up. I mean, they're just confused in this matriarchy, but it's not like these are the conquering spirits. That's what I don't see in in a lot of these guys. But anyway, I can't follow where he stands on anything. It's a lot of fun to read him, but like I said, where does he think this elite is going to emerge from? He has such contempt for common people. And again, I don't know whether to take him seriously. You don't know when he's trolling or not.
Well, this goes back to the Übermensch of Nietzsche again.
Well, like you said, it's all a gloss on Nietzsche. It's Nietzsche, it's a little bit Camille Paglia. And there's one more that I was thinking of earlier.
Well, he name-checked Schopenhauer several times. You mentioned Jack Donovan. He does not, Bronze Age Pervert does not share the rather gross and insane misogyny of Donovan. He does have very strong hatred of matriarchy, which he sees at the central to the modern bugman way of living. And I think he's absolutely right about that.
We got a super chat from Brundlefly. He says, would Kevin Michael Grace prefer to live in the Stone, Bronze, or Iron Age? Which is the best age for being a pervert? Also, what brand of cigarettes is best?
The cigarette question is easy to answer for me. My preferred brand is Gitane, but you can't get them anymore, or it's very difficult to get them. I wouldn't want to live in any of those ages, and it's not a question that I could possibly entertain. I mean, leaving aside the fact that, when people, even Bronze Age Pervert, they talk about prehistorical ages, what do we know about them? I mean, he makes a lot of the ignorance, the learned ignorance of scientists, but again, falling into the same trap.
Right.
Our knowledge of prehistory is obviously minimal.
Well, and he tries to argue at some point that it's totally untrustworthy because people could have excised entire centuries, right, and just inserted. Well, we knew that, That's this. There must be a name for this fallacy, but we see it introduced, this uncertainty fallacy, where people want to introduce it as if it's not, if it doesn't affect their side equally of whatever it is they're saying. But
it's just, my version of history is right. Everyone else's version of history is wrong. I wanted to mention one of the things.
Okay, so I was so inspired by talking about Bronze Age Pervert, I started streaming at about 6:50 this morning. Let me fast forward to more from this show that I did with Kevin Michael Grace, Dennis Dale, Casey on June 22nd, 2018.
Right, and the sexual freedoms is that now all these awesome things to do, to go do with other guys.
Sure, they're more expressive, unless we decide we're going to call ourselves what we are, white people, and in expressive, louder, and all that's great. I love them. I'm kind of
white are banging on drums in the city center and dancing and singing, and it seems quite lively to me, and it also seems authentic, like authentically theirs or ours. Whereas I don't know that I could just show up at a like one of Duvid's interfaith, like at a Hindu temple. Like I'm always.
And Luke Croft says, are there any good parts of Bronze Age Pervert? Yes, he's brilliant. He is learned. He is steeped in the ancient Greeks who had some thought-provoking philosophy. And there are times when he has some pretty sharp provocations, all right? Things that make you think a second time, kind of stop you in your tracks.
Going to feel like an outsider. So what we have to do is to find it within ourselves, and that's what I'm assuming. Bronze Age Pervert is a white guy. Can we assume that?
Yes.
Yeah. So if so, like the Greeks did this, right? This was the mystery school came out of there, and I don't know. I'm just a guy hoping that a new messiah shows up for the whites.
Don't fall for this business like you're a white guy, that you're some bland thing, Yeah, I mean the Southern people, like Luke's talking about, are more expressive, louder, and all that's great. I love them. I kind of thrive in that environment myself, but our people.
So I was reading or listening to a New York Times article on self-help guru, the author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, and he lived for many years in Latin America because he came from a relatively repressed, according to him, Anglo-Saxon upbringing, and so he really enjoys how emotionally expressive Latin Americans are. And as someone who came from an Anglo-Saxon upbringing myself, and who treasures my Anglo-Saxon family and that civilization, yeah, I've enjoyed Jewish culture, which is much more emotionally expressive. So I understand why people who come from a more emotionally repressed upbringing can enjoy dipping into experimenting with traveling around a more emotionally expressive upbringing. Not that there aren't many wonderful things about the Northern European civilization.
People are quieter, modest, reserved, and fuck those goddamn Southerners. We're not going to fucking copy those assholes. Fuck them. I'm tired of hearing of this shit. We need to preserve our way, and there's a way that is suited for you, Manic, and me, because it's in our goddamn genes, and it's been evolved. Yes, it's evolved over centuries in us. We're suited toward a way of life that is gentler, kinder than this fucking hellhole they're visiting upon us. And these other people are going to beat us because they're stronger, they're more cohesive, they're louder, they're brasher, they're more expressive. Unless we decide we're going to call ourselves what we are, white people, and in a sort of war with these others.
Yeah, I don't think that mindset that we're white people at war with non-white people is a useful mindset to the extent that people identify anything like what Dennis is talking about. People identify as English, they identify as French, they identify as German or Norwegian or Swiss or Canadian or Australian or American, right? Very few people in the United States, North America, Australia, Europe identify primarily as white and feel at war with the non-whites around them. That's not going to be an adaptive strategy for most people, right? Most people get their primary sense of meaning from their community, from their family, from their religion. So people identify as Protestant, as Presbyterian, as Methodist, as Seventh-day Adventist, as Anglican, or Roman Catholic, or Jewish, or they identify with their family and their extended family or their profession, right? Not many white people feel like they are at war with non-whites, and life in first world countries, right, is not really suited for a white person to go out there with an attitude of, we're at war with non-whites. It's not usually an adaptive strategy.
And defend these values of modesty and a more chaste.
Yeah. I'd like to live in a Jane Austen world. I like that world. I like 1950s America. I liked the stiff upper lip. I grew up in Australia, where men did not cry, where you did not spill over with emotion. But what you had is your mates. You had very strong ties with your mates in Australia because everyone was white and everyone basically was of Northern European heritage dominantly. And so you had a cohesive community, and mateship was just very strong. And so someone was making an absurd comment in the chat that I have something against friendship or closeness between men. The very opposite. What I love about traditional ways of life is that it makes forming close bonds so much easier, whether it's Orthodox Judaism or like pre-1980s Australia, where you had an overwhelmingly white country where mates were matey with each other. It was cool that like 10 of you would all go out to the outback and shoot kangaroos or climb a mountain or go on a hike or whatever guys want to do. But one of the problems with the rise of homosexual rights and homosexual freedoms is that now all these awesome things to do, to go do with other guys, as many of them are getting called gay, and there's this like suspicion of male friendship, which is a great point that the Bronze Age mindset book makes, that in today's age there's a suspicion of male friendship, and that's just a horrible thing.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'm not surprised that he put that in there. That's what I think his aesthetic is, which is that there's a part of us that goes, ew, that's gay, when we see a guy with his shirt off. But maybe we could get over that a little bit and not be so freaked out and run in the other direction and just be like, cool, just whatever. It's just a guy with his, you don't have to be anything. You're just neutral about it. It's just a guy, Luke, I have to go in a minute, and I'm sorry, I got to eat dinner with the kids and stuff. But I wanted to say that a lot of that description of Australia, which is the one that my dad tells me about from the early 50s in America also, where they're running around and swimming in the swimming hole and all that stuff. Doesn't it seem like there's like active outdoory kinds of things are how men bond? And so if we take those away,
And chat says 40 has given up on inspiring visions of the future like 1960s revolutionaries. He's ended up as an individualist consumer. Well, on my 2 trips back to Australia in the last 18 months, I experienced an inspiring vision of the future. Do you know what it's like to be around large numbers of people who are basically on the same page? I mean, that's incredible. So to whatever extent we can produce a coherent, cohesive culture that is moving towards a more inspiring vision of the future. So step 1 is locking up super predators, right? We could have 10% of the crime rate that we currently have and have a much more coherent, cohesive, safe society where women could feel, safe walking out alone at night to, go to the grocery store or go to a club or, a coffee shop or a bar, if we simply locked up super predators. So that's my plank number 1 for an inspiring future, right? Lock up super predators and enable freedom of association. Roll back civil rights legislation with all its perverse incentives to put different groups at war with each other, to encourage litigation, to have the government regulating the most private parts of our life. I would like to lock up super predators, number 1 priority. Second priority, roll back all the civil rights legislation to enable people to enjoy their private property, to enable people to enjoy freedom of association, and to enable the development of coherent, cohesive, organic communities where people can experience the joy of being on the same page with other people and live in communities where pretty much everybody's on the same page. That's my vision of the future.
You can't shoot kangaroos, but you can only play video games or, you know, at most aggressive basketball. It feels like society is built in a way that's gay. You know,
does 40 engage in wrestling and frolicking with his mates? Sure, yeah, a lot of dancing at the Orthodox shores I go to, a lot of wrestling, a lot of Krav Maga, self-defense courses, training with guns. Yeah, good stuff.
You know, or that's feminine or whatever. And what we really need are, you know, hunting trips or something like that. The problem is that it just seems like there's no way to do that other than like the LARPy weekend camping trip, but it needs to be a part of almost every day of the week instead. So anyway, I'm off for the night, but
okay, thanks for coming by. Some good points there, Medic. Kevin, I had to mute you because there was some ungodly noise in the background, but go ahead and unmute when you're ready so that you can wave back in. So,
okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay. When I was in grade 9, I moved from North Vancouver to Vancouver, and East Vancouver then was dominated by Italians. I had no experience with Italians. I found this rather shocking and distressing. I realized after some time.
And I do like intense emotional relationships with men, right? Where we do dance and we do wrestle and we do engage in self-defense and, right, we're close physically, emotionally. All right, that's really important to me. The problem in living in a, you know, gay is great, gay, everything is gay around you, is that these normal forms of human connection and bonding between men, you know, become increasingly uncomfortable for many people. So yeah, two blokes going off to the desert to look at flowers in bloom, or, you know, men going together to the opera or to appreciate the higher arts, right, now gets classified as gay. It didn't used to get classified as gay 50, 70, 80 years ago. There's, you know, nothing inherently gay. Two men sleeping in the same bed, two men, you know, going out into the woods backpacking together. But in our society that's become increasingly gay, then all these normal, healthy forms of friendship between men have become, you know, sexualized, at least in many minds, and stigmatized.
And that this emotionalism of the Italians, particularly the Southern Italians, is mostly put on. No one could be that aggrieved all the time. And I realized that they put on a front of being insulted by everything in order not to be insulted. In the same way, I learned from reading Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle, that the Japanese are not the robots that we are told they are, that they are exceedingly emotional, and that the elaborate system of convention they have is designed to suppress their emotionality.
Do I dream about colonizing the stars? I confess I don't really think about it. I guess at times I've been moved by various movies or documentaries or books I've read on the topic. It's not something I think about very much. Fraser says, Australia is only cohesive in specific localities. Much of urban Australia is turbo multiculturalism. Younger cohorts are quickly becoming more and more diverse. So I've spent about 4 months in Sydney in the last 18 months. Sydney's incredibly multicultural and incredibly cohesive. Now, still the least cohesive part of Australia, probably, but still so much more cohesive, so much lower in crime, so much more trusting. There's so much more of a sense that you're on the same page together. So they would show the World Cup at big outdoor parks, and people from, you know, many different nations would gather in the park, appreciate the World Cup. But there's still much more of a sense of being on the same page compared to arriving back in Los Angeles at LAX and riding the bus and, you know, going to Venice or Santa Monica Beach. There's almost no sense of being on the same page with other people. When I went to Bondi Beach and the other great beaches in Sydney's eastern suburbs, yeah, there was a strong sense that you're on the same page together, even though this is, you know, about the most multicultural and diverse part of Australia. They have developed a type of multiculturalism and diversity that still enables low crime rates and relatively high rates of social cohesion and social trust, though not as high as in regional Australia, country Australia. All right, they have, you know, far, far higher rates of social trust and social cohesion there. But what Australia has at its most multicultural and diverse is still light years ahead of what people in general get to enjoy in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Miami.
Their high emotion, such that it does not overflow. In the same way that the stiff upper lip of the English is again a response to the traditional intense romanticism of the English.
Right, these are both island nations that have to evolve these elaborate rituals of courtesy to make living so intensely together livable.
Yeah, I mean, Bronze Age Pervert makes an excellent point in the book, which you mentioned, that this idea of male friendship is now considered risible or dangerous. Because it's all gay. Well, it isn't. And, on y soit qui mal y pense is my reaction to that. These are the worst people in the world. These are the people who go through, the letters of previous age when some man expresses, his feelings for another man. Oh, gay, gay. And I just think that these people are the worst and shouldn't be tolerated. But, he makes a strong point in the book, and I think it's very important that in keeping men from a fellowship is one of the ways in which the elite has brought about this global homo world, that there's no possibility of resistance.
And how have we severely damaged fellowship among men or among groups in general? The massive civil rights legislation with its incentives for litigation and the diminishing of private property and freedom of association. We've essentially, as Christopher Caldwell points out in his terrific book, The Age of Entitlement, we've replaced the Constitution that we developed in the 18th century with a brand new Constitution, right? The Civil Rights Constitution has overridden our traditional rights and virtues.
Because, you get 5 or 6 men together, it must be gay, right? I mean, I'll just point out in passing that it is curious to me that the worst insult the homosexual has is you're just like me.
Yeah.
It's the worst insult.
And a social dynamic completely changes when you bring a woman into the mix. You can have 6 guys, kibitzing and hanging out, sitting around a table, drinking, eating, having uproarious conversation. And then the conversation and the whole atmosphere will change dramatically once you introduce a woman to the midst. And essentially, like in a workplace, you can have high morale if it's all men, or at least where there are places where in the workplace it can be all men. But once you introduce women into that mix, if the women are, a 5 or above, the guys are going to be thinking about banging her. And they're also going to be pulling their punches, and it's just going to ruin male camaraderie. Just like one single woman will ruin the male camaraderie between 12 guys. And this has destroyed all the service clubs, the Kiwanis and the other service clubs. Once they were forced to start allowing women into their midst, it just destroyed the camaraderie. Men dropped out because unless you preserve a space where men can just be with men, they're going to drop out of service clubs. They're going to drop out of religions. They're going to drop out of voluntary organizations. They're going to drop out of community organizations because men are wired to want to be with men unless it's their spouse or.
Yeah, men want to be with men and women want to be with men. But often women don't want to be with other women, and often men don't want to be with women.
Or a family member. There's like absolutely no reason for most men, most of the time, to be interacting with a woman. You're not going to be getting like great insights into life from the woman. Like by and large, the more a man is able to interact solely with other men, aside from his spouse, the happier he is.
Well, no, you're quite right about that. If one woman enters into a group of men, the men will typically try to, 1, impress her, or 2, seduce her, or both. If a group of women enter into a group of men, then the group becomes subverted by these female jealousies that men simply cannot understand. I'll give you an example, a simple example. That if a man, let's say a man buys a new car, let's say it's a Hyundai, one of the better ones, and he starts talking about how much he loves this car. No man, he would be expelled if he pulled this kind of stunt. Would say something like, I have an Audi. In other words, you're a jerk. My car is better than yours. But this is the sort of thing that women do without thinking, this constant jockeying for status. And it makes it impossible to relax. This may have come up before, but, I've told women, no, we don't spend our time talking about you, bitching about you, because we get together to have a good time, not a bad time.
Men don't get their spaces anymore, though, because it's considered a conspiracy. And if it's white men, if it's more than 3 white guys anywhere, unsupervised, it's a hate crime at this point. Women still have their sanctuary, though, I think. Both sexes need it, obviously. The tension goes up. Everything you described, it just ratchets up the tension in any group dynamic, you put the woman in there. And you're right. Rarely are you working. I guess we have to work with women now. So in those work situations, you have a reason. You're forced to interact with a woman for a reason other than sex.
Right. There's no reason in males' benefit to interact with women aside from their family. I guess there are exceptions. There are some brilliant women, but by and large, it just saps your morale. It complicates your life. It compromises you. I think I notice when I go through life that the men who can spend the most of their life with other men are far and away happier than men who are just having to constantly interact with women.
There was a political party in Canada that rose in the late 1980s, and by the 1990s it had become the official opposition. It was called the Reform Party. This later got folded into what's now called the Conservative Party, which replaced the Progressive Conservative Party. But I was writing a story about the party years ago, and I found out to my amazement that they invited the spouses of caucus members to caucus meetings. And I asked several of the Reform MPs about this. Basically, my question is, what are you, nuts? And they say, well, what's wrong with that? I said, you can't have any kind of honesty in a situation like that. Some woman bursts into tears because her husband was criticized.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It just destroys morale. It just destroys morale. It confuses people. It like saps our institutions. I mean, now the military has had to increasingly open up to women. And so, I mean, the military doesn't have the morale it used to have. Sports clubs don't have the morale they used to have. Service clubs don't have the morale they used to have. Modern forms of religion, mainstream forms of religion don't have the morale they used to have, except for in those forms of traditional religion where there are very separate roles for men and women. In Orthodox Judaism, by and large, there's high morale among men. In Reform and Conservative Judaism, men are increasingly difficult to find because unless you set aside specific rituals, specific spaces, specific tasks for men only, men are going to drop out. There's no way they're going to compete with women. It's just completely demoralizing. It's icky. Like no man wants to have to compete with a woman. It's like, competing with a retarded child.
Whoa. It's just different, and it's often awkward. Now, I enjoy my interactions and friendships with women, but I certainly appreciate male-only spaces as well. All right, this is an interview with Jack Butler of National Review on emerging forms of paganism on the right, such as the Bronze Age mindset here.
Much more primal. And the primary exponent of this, someone I'm sure we will talk about at length in the rest of this podcast, is a fellow who calls himself Bronze Age Pervert, but his actual name is Custom Mario. So those are two of the varieties. Those are the ones that I talk about in the article, and they both have become more prominent as Christianity's role in public life fades. And this is what I believe it was Ross Douthat who said something along the lines of, although he's not alone in saying this, that if you didn't like the religious right, get ready for the post-religious right.
I was just going to reference the exact same quote from Ross.
Yes.
About the right in particular, because the left paganism, I think we've discussed ad nauseum through the lens of wokeness. I've described as being a civic religion without forgiveness, but with perpetual atonement. You can see the same sacraments and rituals kind of aping traditional religion. But the vitalism, the right paganism, is what seems to be new on the scene. So why don't we start here down that road? Who or what is Bronze Age pervert, and what is the Bronze Age lifestyle?
As far as I know, it's a who, not a what. Name Costin Almariu, Yale political science PhD from Romania. Don't know much else about him. Much of his actual activities he's one of these internet personalities who likes to shroud his life in secrecy and just post on Twitter. That's post with an A in it to specify in lieu of actually having a real public persona. But yeah, and he's the author. Wouldn't really care much about this guy if he weren't the author of this. I don't know if want to call it a book, but he calls it an exhortation called Bronze Age Mindset. And it came out in 2018, became popular in 2019 when people in the orbit of the Trump administration, noticed that they were reading it, especially young adult men in the Trump administration orbit. It's essentially a distillation of this vitalism that I was describing. Its thesis is that the world, as it is currently constituted, exists to suppress the proper expression of masculine virtue and to bury and reject beauty with garbage, I think is the term used, and that this conspiracy of suppression is being orchestrated by people the author calls bugmen or human cockroaches. So it's pretty vivid language, intentionally ungrammatical in parts. It's supposed to be written in this kind of internet vernacular to bring Nietzscheanism to a modern audience. But this is all being directed against people that the author calls superior specimens, that the people for whom the text is written, whom he calls to rise above this in ways that are vague but also disturbing at the same time. And at the root of all this also is a anti-American founding belief that the founding principles are not actually responsible for America's success. It's just the extent to which people involved in it accessed their Bronze Age mindset, which I should say that the titular Bronze Age mindset in the book is described most pithily by the author as the desire to be worshipped as a god. That's the one sentence description. So founding doesn't matter. Christianity suppresses the natural spirit of man, and also various figures associated with Christianity, including Augustine, probably didn't exist. So it's just very like, it's in the long tradition of people who believe that the Christian worldview is responsible for a great enfeebling of Western men, not a great ennobling of them. So we've gotten that again, which is great. So now, and it's hard to tell how popular this really is because the author counsels readers, if asked, to deny that they have read the work. So, but there is a following, and I'll get into, if you want to ask a more specific question, I'll get into how I think is the best way to approach dealing and arguing with this person. But I'll let you. I'm sure I've given a lot here, so I feel like I should hand it back to you because there's a lot to clarify and a lot to elaborate.
There's a certain interesting overlap there in the the way that they treat the American founding with, say, like the Patrick Deneen crowd, who is also hostile to the American founding, although certainly coming from a different perspective that is affirming of Christianity, but rejecting nonetheless of the Enlightenment-informed liberalism that helped craft the American founding.
Right. There is some overlap, but also these two groups are incompatible and at each other's throats. Understandably so. I mean, this is the Bronze Age mindset is explicitly an anti-Christian thing, and integralism or post-liberalism, whatever you want to call it, for all of its flaws, it's still Christian. So these things are not going to, they can't go together. And you've seen these two groups at odds with one another. Most recently, this was one of the proximate causes of the most recent article I wrote against the new paganism for National Review. There was this blow up over, I believe the website, the publication was LifeSite News. They tweeted an article about how in states where abortion has been banned or severely restricted, the number of abortions is actually going down. This is something that pro-lifers naturally would celebrate. But it chose, the website chose as the featured image for this article a picture of a black baby. And this caused a very specific vitriolic group of people online, the Vitalists, to be very mad because fundamentally, they don't, if fewer abortions means more non-white babies, they would rather have more abortions. Like, as simple as that. And that goes into the eugenic preoccupation of vitalism. I mean, Bronze Age mindset is pretty explicit about this, and Almario himself, as a result of this blow up, became very clear about his belief that the success of ancient Greek civilization in particular was attributable to explicitly eugenic practices. And he would like to bring these back. He has written, or said in at least one forum, that he wants to reinstate what he calls a Platonic Lebensborn program, this was the thing that the Nazis did to refine the Aryan race. So it's again, one of the problems with all of this is it's hard to tell where the trolling ends and where the earnestness begins. And this is in part because the Almario and some of the people around him and some of the people who are fans with him, they're all downstream to some extent of the philosopher Leo Strauss. They've really abused their Straussian educations. Leo Strauss is a loaded person to describe, but German philosopher who taught many things, among which was the view that certain texts have a secret meaning that only the truly educated can divine. So this belief encourages people who are taught in this way to employ such devices in their own writing. But I choose.
Yeah, the ancient texts have a secret meaning that only those with a special decoder ring, as Steve Saylor puts it, can understand. Right? This encourages delusion. This encourages losing touch with reality about your own perspicacity and wisdom, that you really know what Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates were really on about, and everyone else doesn't.
To treat it as seriously as I perceive the author and his fans to believe it, and that makes me pretty unsettled given some of the things that are being described here.
As you've described this, the question in my mind is this really just warmed over Nietzscheanism? I mean, it sounds very reminiscent of the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. So in your reading of this, what are the similarities and what, if any differences do you see? Is this can we draw a line between the two?
I think there is at least something of a line to be drawn. Obviously, the contempt for Christianity is there. The enshrinement of certain lives as being inherently more valuable than others. And in a sense, it seems almost like a ChatGPT prompt, like ChatGPT, write Nietzsche's works in the 4chan, the style of a 4chan poster. Again, poster with an A. And so that is a significant element of it. At the same time, I guess I'll choose this moment to clarify. When I said this work was written as an exhortation, the most charitable perspective I could possibly apply to it is that there are certain things that are described in it and in the worldview of the author that have elements of truth to them. Like, I do believe that the modern left, at the beginning of this podcast, I was describing my problems with left paganism. I believe that is real and that it has worked against the authentic expression of masculine virtue, against many of the essential fundaments of civilization as we've understood it, against truth, against beauty, against all these things. So the reason that I've got into these trenches is not because I'm some stick in the mud or some believer that everything right now is okay. I don't think that this response, A, either it makes sense, or B, actually meaningfully separates from the problems that it describes. So, like, if it's also post-religious, then what good is it, for example? If it's also anti-founding, then how is it going to help us? If it is also anti-family, as Bronze Age mindset fundamentally is in its belief that creating a civilization where the strong, the justice is once again the role of the stronger fundamentally, and is more important than family life, then how is that going to help? So I find it in certain ways actually more of a reinforcer of the most injurious parts of life today than any sort of calling to something better. And so that's why I've devoted so much intellectual energy to rebutting it and to stressing that I am not, by doing so, merely trying to discount criticisms of the way things are today.
Why don't we dive a little bit into those criticisms of the way things are today? So you point out here in the piece, that of course we'll include in the show notes, that you concede modern society suppresses, quote, the authentic expression of masculine virtue, and that conservatism has failed in many respects. So what would be the bill of particulars there? In what way do you see society as being suppressing of the authentic expression of masculine virtue? And of course, feel free as you answer this to contextualize how you think this approach to it, the Bronze Age mindset thing, is a improper response to legitimate concerns. But talk about what you see as the ways in which masculine virtue is suppressed, and that conservatism, by your lights, has failed in many respects.
So on the first thing, it can seem, in some instances, hard to quantify that, except when you look at the downstream consequences. So I think the fact that the problems that young males in particular are facing these days, where they're falling behind on so many social metrics, and this is a result, at least in part, of just the total disappearance. Well, I won't say total disappearance, but a significant diminution of positive male role models, both in their lives and in the broader culture. And this comes from a strange left-wing antipathy toward the idea that differences between the sexes are valid and that they are complementary. Like, there's this attempt to blur them together, to deny the utility of distinctions, and to reject the idea that both sexes bring something important to life by being different from one another. Male and female, he created them. That's what Genesis says. But then that's a good thing, and they are good as distinct from one another. And both of them, like, obviously, both can be like they're meant to balance one another out. But I think we have in the world today many instances of that just not being the case, where the male men in America today, there's a weird kind of bifurcation where I can't remember who wrote this essay now, but you have wimps on one hand and barbarians on the other. There is this hollowing out of the essential male center of someone who is capable of doing what men have been expected to do for decades. But the result is either to totally curdle into selfishness in either direction, where you're either in your basement playing video games all day, or you are, I don't know, what would be even the real world instantiation of something like what the Bronze Age mindset teaches. Well, I think a couple weeks ago, now I can't remember the name of this Twitter account, but it was just saying like the way to be a real man, first you got to get a vasectomy, and then you got to make sure you got to swear off women entirely, and never even think about having children, and just like spend 24 hours a day, 8 days a week, 25 hours a day, 8 days a week lifting. I'm pro lifting, by the way, but when you are, this sounds, what that reminds me of is the scene in American Psycho where he's in bed with a prostitute and just looking at himself in the mirror while he's having sex with her. I mean, that's the other end of the spectrum. And so we have that in those two things in abundance today. We don't have this central center having been hollowed out. And now I've gone on so long, I've forgotten what your second question was.
The second question was about...
why is this a problem?
Well, the failures of conservatism as well, which is, I guess when I'm looking at that statement in your piece, there seems, this is where I think we get terminologically confused, or some people get terminologically confused, because there's almost nothing in your description of vitalism or of this Bronze Age mindset that strikes me as being in any meaningful way conservative.
No.
There's certainly an association of it with the right, and I've interviewed Matt Continetti about his book as well, and I appreciated the distinction that he made there in separating the conservative movement from the right. I think that helps us understand the current circumstances fairly well. So, in what way what are the failures of conservatism as you see them, and in what way did those failures, real or imagined, impact and help drive this kind of a worldview if it seems to be so clearly set apart from conservatism as I think you and I understand it? Well,
I think one thing that happened, I think conservatism still to a considerable extent is caught in a post-Cold War, post-Reagan aimlessness. And that's essentially lasted for longer than my adult life. There was, I not to be overly nostalgic about a period that I had no historical memory of, obviously, but during that Cold War period, there was a kind of focus and confidence within the conservative movement, obviously with exceptions and all sorts of complications, as Matt Continetti could explain at greater length. But there was at least a sense of what we believed and why we believed it. But since the end of the Cold War, things have been a little more aimless. And I think a lot of people within conservatism have been coasting on conservatism, and
is this a stand-in a sense for this lack of masculinity that I feel I see this online all the time, that rather than embodying the values of that kind of masculine center you described earlier, the form that it seems to take is people who just, again, post with an A very aggressively online, which, fine, I have a Twitter account and I tweet too, so I'm not here to tell people to not, engage with the internet or social media at all, although don't tweet is always the best advice.
Yes.
It is kind of a stand-in for the things that are missing, but it is, I guess, the term that I wrote down here was LARPing.
LARPing, one of my favorite words.
Yeah, it's for people who aren't, again, familiar, who aren't terminally online like it seems that Jack and I
lucky
are.
them.
It stands for live action role playing. It's like people who dress up in costume to pretend that they are, in the video game Halo, or that they are, Jedi Knights or something like that. It is a form of taking fiction and online culture and bringing it into the real world.
Yes, I mean, that is definitely going on here, and that should itself tell you something. If our culture has so thoroughly debauched and diluted actual masculinity that the best that a lot of people can do is to aggressively talk about their physiognomy to one another on Twitter, that something has gone seriously wrong. And yeah, and that's why I have a certain measure of sorrow for people like that, I feel, because they have been totally misled by culture that doesn't know better, by the lack of actual examples of true masculinity in their lives, and they need to be called to something better. And I am somewhat at a loss as to how to do that. I'm trying to do that in my own work and to the extent that I'm able. But yeah, the substitute has become this LARPing, as you described it, which at best amounts to a parody or caricature of actual masculinity. And that is not going to get us anywhere. That is only going to corrupt the souls of the people who try to display it and coarsen the civic fabric of our country. But yeah, as for this intersection with other parts of the right, I mentioned the Straussians earlier. I think the part of the reason that Bronze Age mindset has made whatever headway it actually has made, again, impossible to discern fully. He speaks not just in 4chan vernacular, but also in a Straussian vernacular. And this, for some reason, it calls a certain kind of mind similarly trained. It gets them interested in engaging with it on its own, at what they think is its own level. They think that they can enter the Straussian dimension and do combat with this person and its ideas. And I think, in my experience of such attempts, all that really happens is you end up, it's like Khan entering the Mutara Nebula in Star Trek 2. Except that this analogy is a little backwards because Kirk is the good guy, but you enter his playing field, and then you can't exit that unsullied. So I think that the ultimate result of the Claremont engagement with Bronze Age mindset that you described is not that the Bronze Age mindset types and the author became more like what Claremont at its best, at its should be, but that it became more like him and work.
How much of this do you think would exist without the prevalence of the internet? This just seems like such an internet-driven phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, it's live-action role-playing. This is a guy, Bronze Age Pervert, who seems to have pretty much given up on real life career, real life family, real life connections to exist in a cyberspace where he can imagine he's being worshipped as a god.
So let me ask this same question kind of two ways. You had alluded earlier to we could get into your views on how to effectively take this on and rebut these kinds of arguments that are being made by these people. And part of it also that is in the piece at National Review that we're discussing today, and of course we'll include in the show notes, is an argument for a forceful reinvigoration of Christianity. What does that look like to you, and what is your means? How have you discovered the best way to take on these kinds of odd arguments?
My means for that, let's see. I mean, it's means that I think ACT itself is trying to work out. The way that our country is set up, I mean, this is the famous Adams quote, is that it was made for a moral and religious people. So it would be wholly inadequate for any other. Now, Adams did not specify what kind of morals or what kind of religion. I think that I'm Catholic myself. That is my preference here. And I think that, but the way that our federalist architecture and our constitutional system were set up, it depends on those virtues, and it depends on people who believe in those things to actively enter public life and work within the system that was created as a way to pursue the common good as the system designed it to be pursued. And that manifests in all sorts of ways, but it becomes incumbent upon individuals in their respective spheres and at their respective levels to do it. And that's what makes it so tricky. And that's more than any other.
Okay, here's another critique of Bronze Age Pervert's philosophy.
Not just crazy young people sitting in their mother's basement, playing video games.
Well, there is some of that.
Sure.
But no, you're right. And one of the essays that I published recently titled, what's it titled? I've got it right here. The BAP Boys and America.
Yeah.
And it's an attempt to understand and explain how and why a generation primarily of highly educated young men, not only in the United States, but around the world, actually, because this is becoming a worldwide movement, how and why they have become attracted to these extraordinarily bad ideas. And I think it's really important for all of us to understand that the tectonic plates underneath our culture are shifting. right? And this is really why I got interested in this, because the future is always with the young, and to understand where the country is going, you have to understand what it is that is appealing to young people. And in my particular case, I was interested in what young conservatives and libertarians were becoming interested in. And so it's important to begin with a kind of sociological profile of who these young, primarily men, but not all men, what has brought them to this, right? Because this is interesting, because many of these young men 5-6 years ago would have thought of themselves as mainstream Heritage Foundation conservatives or Cato Institute libertarians. But within a very short period of time, they migrated and indeed have come to reject what they call conservatism Inc. and Libertarianism Inc. for this new philosophy. Now, why is it? I mean, who are these young men? Look, this is a generation of primarily young men who, from the time they entered kindergarten until the time they graduate from high school and then college, have been told that they are racist, sexist, and homophobic by virtue of being white, male, and heterosexual, right? And so this is a generation of young men and women who, in effect, have really felt the slings and arrows of the totalitarian left, right? In ways that you and I would not have when we were, going through elementary school and high school and college, even though we had some of it back in the day, but not like them. I mean, they are living in a stifling moral, psychological, intellectual environment and have grown up in this environment. And then all of a sudden one day, when they're maybe say in their 20s, and they come to realize that Brooks Brothers conservatism and white paper libertarianism have been feckless in defending them. They have rejected, they come to reject mainstream conservatism and libertarianism, and then all of a sudden they started looking for these alternatives. Some of them initially went with the so-called alt-right, but in more recent years, they have migrated toward the Catholic tradcons and towards Bronze Age mindset. So, on the one hand, you can say, and I do say in what I've been writing, is that I get it. I understand how and why this generation has become what I call the lost generation. They had no defenders. They had no intellectual defenders. Yep. And there was a vacuum that had been created by conservatism and libertarianism Inc. Right? Nobody's interested in the Cato Institute producing another white paper on free market transportation policy. Right? That's not what interests the young today.
Yeah, there's no inspiration. There's no fight. There's no fight against the evil of the left. There's no projection of what is possible. And I noticed 5 years ago again when the alt-right was active, there were not many, but a few objectivists.
Okay, let me skip that. Let's get to Geoffrey Miller here.
Howdy, everybody.
Justin Murphy.
I'm Geoffrey Miller, and I'm here with my friend and housemate and intellectual sparring partner, Justin Murphy.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about Bronze Age Pervert. Not just any Bronze Age pervert, but the Bronze Age Pervert, and his book, Bronze Age Mindset, which we both read and enjoyed and think is very provocative and also stylistically and kind of intellectually interesting. So, Justin, you've done a little bit of coverage already of Bronze Age Pervert, BAP, as we like to call him, or Bapism. Who is he? Probably not she, possibly them. What are some of the theories we have about who this anonymous edgelord?
Okay, so this is 3 years ago. We now know who he is. So let's fast forward through that.
So I guess one question that viewers might have or listeners might have is, why would an evolutionary psychologist and a political scientist take this book at all seriously? Like, what's the big deal? Some little backstory is this thing was published in June 2018. It's about 200 pages. For some reason, it's #1 currently in the Amazon list for ancient Greek history books, which is kind of a weird achievement. And it's got over 250 reviews on Amazon, which indicates it's probably selling pretty well, $10 on Kindle. And I think this is part of a kind of emerging ecosystem of alternative intellectual culture that includes some people on the far left, the alt-center, the sort of far right, the alt-right, but all of these terms are getting mixed up in very complicated ways, it seems like. And publishing anonymously, I think, is one way to get freedom. And freedom is a big theme in Bronze Age Mindset, or BAM. Freedom stylistically, freedom intellectually, freedom to say shit that nobody can say if they're not anonymous. I don't know how much BAP or the BAP team would worry about getting doxxed for stuff like this, but we're going to try to respect their privacy to some degree, apart from sort of speculating about who's on the team. How do you think, though, Justin, that this fits in with your sort of vision of this emerging social media intellectual culture? Is it kind of breaking new ground in a way for what can be done, what can be communicated?
That's a really good question. I agree with you that I think that's kind of the main interest of the BAP project. It's what it represents in kind of the changing economy of publishing and the changing power distributions with respect to intellectual influence, for sure. Yeah. And I do think in a way that the success of the BAP book definitely updated some people's thinking and strategizing about where power really can be had through, intellectual forms of discourse. And so some people might chuckle at intellectual because the book is, it's funny. A lot of it is tongue in cheek. One gets the impression it's written in this kind of poor grammar that seems to be part of the shtick. But in part because of that, it has this kind of fun, freewheeling vibe to it. And so it's not particularly original or impressive in any kind of scholarly or intellectual way. Like it certainly doesn't break any type of new ground in terms of, long run intellectual progress. It's mostly a kind of remix of Nietzschean ideas and a kind of
a kind of tantalizing male vitalism that I think is quite hard to find elsewhere. So it packages or repackages a number of really interesting things in a fun and interesting and cool way, for sure. I'm not throwing any shade on it. Just to be clear for people who maybe have no idea what we're talking about, it's not really trying to be an impressive sort of intellectual advancement, I don't think.
Yeah, this is not the next big 600-page Steven Pinker book that's
Right.
like deeply researched and has a grand, coherent intellectual vision that tries to be pleasing to both expert scientists and kind of the intelligent lay reader, whatever that is. This is more like, I just rewatched the movie Troy, right? And there's a bit where Achilles is about to attack the Trojan homeland with his myrmidons, his soldiers. And he's like, glory is out there. It's waiting for you. Take it. My hair always stands on end when I hear Achilles say that. And I think this book is supposed to be functioning as a bit of an inspirational exercise to sort of encourage all the other, you know, young edgelords to come out of the woodwork and do more stuff like this and to kind of illustrate this is possible. And you can write something in a style where it's like, ain't got time for grammar.
Yeah.
Grammar's
yeah.
for nerds and wusses and scientists and petty intellectuals.
And Bugmen.
And so,
Right.
yeah,
So-
it's,
Your initial question, though, was why are two professional intellectuals and published academics who write scholarly journal articles talking about this book? And my answer to that personally is this is worth paying attention to, and it's worth being interested in, even from academics who do, you know, more traditional scholarly work or what have you, because of what it represents as a moment in the changing distributions of power when it comes to, you know, I'm just going to say intellectual influence. Whether you think this is an intellectual project or not, that's fine. You can debate that. But I definitely see it as in the intellectual domain for sure. It's messing with our expectations about what a book is supposed to be, or what type of book is worth reading, because that's ultimately what is really interesting here. A lot of people are reading this book, and so in just that regard alone, it's worthy of attention and some consideration. And so I think that's probably why you and I are both interested in it, right? Because it represents, oh, this is like people are moving away from the kind of traditional sources of endorsement, right? Like there, once upon a time, nobody would read a book if it wasn't, you know, through one of the big 5 publishers, or if you didn't have some really famous person on the back of it endorsing it or something like that. Whereas now, if you have your finger on the pulse of some sort of internet subculture and you're
Man, that's really late. There's always been a time where people have had self-publishing successes, where people have published their own newsletters, developed a following, where people would pay hundreds of dollars a year to get your newsletter. My God, did I just... I really played a really weak segment. My bad.
I think actually the rhetoric has a lot in common with Trump's lack of polish. And
yeah, that's right.
From this sort of BAP mindset, or also the alt-right mindset, or also the far left anarchists, anything polished is marketing. It's professional marketing of some sort. It's messaging. It's designed to influence, and you don't trust it. So this sounds tangential, but I think it kind of gets to the heart of the book in a way that I hadn't even thought about before we started this. So yay for dialogue. In Kanye's case, he came out as having bipolar, right?
Okay, I think so.
I think that's right.
Not an expert.
I've studied mood disorders, and it certainly seems plausible. Like, yeah, he's got some manic episodes and maybe some depression, but also, of course, he's got world-class narcissism, particularly when he was younger. Like, he was a genius, and he really fucking knew it and wanted to tell the world about it and show it off. The problem, if you're an atheist genius, is you don't really have a structure for reining in that runaway narcissism.
Yep.
I faced this a little bit in grad school. I was very, very arrogant intellectually. You know, I'm kind of smart, but I was, to be honest, smarter back then, younger. Fluid intelligence peaks in the early 20s. And I knew I had good ideas. I think in retrospect, one way that I kind of managed them was, instead of submitting to God, I submitted to science and scholarship, and particularly Darwin. Darwin became my sort of icon of, I think I'm hot shit, but I knew my respect for him was even stronger. And half of the ideas I had, he had already had. So by kind of submitting to Darwin as a sort of patriarchal godlike figure, it actually kind of helped preserve my mental health, because it kept me from having these kind of runaway delusions of grandeur. I could never convince myself, oh, everything I'm writing in the mating mind is 100% original. By contrast, BAP says, well, Nietzsche would try to avoid reading other people because he didn't want to be infected by their ideas. Okay, that kind of makes sense from a kind of like purity-oriented, I don't want to be infected with bad memes point of view. Like, that's kind of the rationale for Congress telling Facebook you have to get rid of fake news. We don't want to be infected by meme cooties. The problem with Nietzsche doing that is there's nothing to rein in his runaway narcissism. And he does get delusions of grandeur. And they're exacerbated by having, syphilis and it fucking up his brain in later years. But I suspect Kanye, at least at an unconscious level, realized there's this amazing God hack where if I submit to a Christian God, any God, it actually helps me be more productive, more on an even keel, and even a more effective genius, because I don't think I'm the biggest thing around.
That's right. It also gives you something to wrap your pursuit of glory around. Like, glory is a kind of traditional masculine aspiration, and there is a decline of a sense of glory today. Most young men, they have drives towards something like glory because there is something natural there, but most secular kind of normal bug men are incapable of really aspiring towards a true kind of historical glory. And I think that's in part because of the decline of God and the incapacity to believe. Because the only way that you can do things on this earth that are truly profound and revolutionary, that no one else wants to do, that everyone else is afraid to do, the only way to do that is you have to kind of hang yourself on some type of pivot, some type of fulcrum that is to some degree outside of this world, I think. At least that's kind of how I see it. And, so there's like this passage in the opening part of the Bat book where he talks about Empedocles and Mount Etna. And, Empedocles is famous for throwing himself into the volcano, essentially, and, in a kind of pursuit of glory or what have you. And that sort of thing is sort of unthinkable for most Western men today. And yeah, I'm all for bringing back a submission to God as the pathway to a reclamation of the pursuit of glory and kind of profound creative independence. Yeah, it's not a kind of oppressive, authoritarian constraint like so many stupid people think it is. It's a hack, as you put it, that unlocks a profound kind of liberation combined with a kind of based angering.
Yeah, so one mark of a good book is when you're trying to talk about it, it actually sparks new ideas and you go off on tangents that aren't actually even that related to the book, but here we are. I think for the Maynard, the Band of Brothers, their pursuit of glory was all about me as an individual, going to be a great warrior. My name will echo down through history. My highest aspiration is to have a glorious death that my brothers will sing about forever. That's very much a sort of Indo-European warrior mindset. It's a Viking mindset. It's
a Bronze Age,
a Bronze Age mindset,
yeah.
perhaps. And this submitting to God is a little bit different. I think, whereas a modern billionaire will typically build a skyscraper named after themselves, like a Trump Tower, literally, or they'll endow a university research center that's named after them. Your medieval rich guys would fund the building of a cathedral for the glory of God, and then they would bask in that reflected glory. So yeah, their name or their likeness would be included in the cathedral, but it would be Lincoln Cathedral for the town of Lincoln, not some particular guy's cathedral. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also an interesting status hack, that you can actually get all the prestige of supporting a collective endeavor without looking like too much of a narcissist or an egoist.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. It's a way to be kind of aggressively narcissistic about your own ambitions and powers without actually falling into the traps of narcissism, because you're chalking it up to something higher, something above you.
And I think even publishing a book anonymously in a way is also a sort of hack for distancing the persona of the person ostensibly writing the book, Bronze Age Pervert, versus whoever that person really is. And so if you make that distinction between, like, this is my real life versus my social media or authorial persona, you don't have to take that authorial persona too seriously. And you also kind of have to think about the care and feeding of it. Like, how am I going to support my ongoing social media persona? And I feel this, like, if I haven't tweeted in a while, it's like people are missing Primal Poly out there, I think, maybe. Like, I have to maintain this. I have to water that plant. I have to feed that horse or whatever. So I think we've talked about submission. We've talked about power. The other dimension, of course, of submit is it's got a little bit of a BDSM power exchangey edge to it. And when I lecture about BDSM in my human sexuality class, I emphasize it freaks people out because we've absorbed this sort of egalitarian vision of highly consensual sex that is sort of supposed to be the gold standard for sexual ethics, but that actually a lot of people find really asexy, like not very sexy, not very hot. And I think what the Manosphere is doing, what the Red Pill guys are doing, what BAP is doing is trying to put the power back into sex. The gender feminists will say rape is a crime of power, not sex, but they actually don't have a very coherent way of thinking about the relations between power and sex. So I think domination, submission, it's just kind of fascinating to me that you can see elements of that hierarchical psychology, both in the relationship between worshipers and their god, the warrior bands and their sort of leaders, and people doing BDSM roleplay in their own bedrooms. There's a thirst for that kind of hierarchical power structure.
Right.
And modern civilization is very, very uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, that's a good diagnosis. I think you're right. It's tapping something there. It's tapping some sort of unsatisfied latent demand for something like that. Now, I have a question for you. Have you seen the images online that are associated with BAP and his crowd, the hot male Chad photos that he likes to post and that his followers like to post?
Yeah.
Like, what do you think's up with that? What's your diagnosis of that?
I think this is another case where people are absolutely unable to understand what the fuck's going on with the worship of the male physique without shoehorning it into there's latent homosexuality going on here. I don't think that actually makes sense. I think it's a total failure to understand how boys and young men actually tune into what is going to be successful as I grow up in terms of training strategies and regimens and paths to material and reproductive success.
So when these people in the BAP crowd like to pass around photos of, for folks who haven't seen what I'm talking about, it's not just like jacked men with their shirts off. It's like extremely jacked men, like hilariously jacked men with their shirts off or half naked or even often making somewhat like sexual poses. So this is something that they like to pass around. But your diagnosis, if I hear you correctly, Geoffrey, is that this is actually a pretty straightforward, non-sexual valorization and admiration of male strength. That's how you read it?
I think it's a little bit complicated, but imagine Imagine two different 10-year-old boys with different psychologies and ask yourself who would do better in a sort of prehistoric competition for resources, status, and mates. One 10-year-old boy pays very close attention to which young men are big and strong and capable and respected and have killed other men and mated with women and care about hierarchy and status. And I'm going to sort of pay a lot of attention to those role models, those aspirational figures. Like really close attention. What do they do? How do they act? How do they look? Because I want to transform myself to be more like them. Does that mean you actually want to have sex with them? I don't think it does. It means there's a psychological adaptation that directs your attention to the good phenotypic traits of body, brain, and behavior that are worth emulating. Imagine the other 10-year-old who like looks around and sees a bunch of people, some of them successful, some not, and who's like, I don't know who I should imitate or who I should learn from. I'm not even going to pay attention to who has more muscles or who's more capable in hunting and fighting. I don't think that 10-year-old boy is going to do as well. So imagine there's a pretty long history of selection for boys and men to pay attention to, like who's worth emulating, and for their physical and behavioral features to capture our attention. It's just like when men watch war movies. Why do we find it fascinating to watch fighting and bloodshed? We've seen hundreds of decapitations by age 30 if you watch TV and movies. So why watch yet another one? Because we've evolved to pay very close attention to combat.
So that's a cool reading of it for sure, and I think there's something there. The thing that doesn't quite square up with that is these men who are kind of idolized in the BAP sphere. They're kind of so jacked that I do believe that for extreme bodybuilders, there's fitness cost, right? Like that's not an optimal body, right? For extremely jacked men. So there's something else. I think you're right, but there's something else going on, right? Because if it was just what you said, then they would pass around photos of kind of ideally, optimally fit, strong men, but kind of more in the traditional mold of like, Calvin Klein, underwear models or whatever, like pretty, fit, chiseled, healthy, good-looking men with, all the women and the nice cars and all that, right? So there's an extra component going on. I don't know, is it satirical? Is it somewhat homosexual? Is it just edgelording? Is it just kind of the thrill of extreme, depictions? But there's something interesting and weird going on with the particular fetishization of these like extremely jacked men in often sexual kind of angles.
I think the analogy I would make here is, why do teenage girls love watching YouTube makeup tutorials? Is it that they're all latent lesbians and they just love seeing beauty because they want the beauty, they want to interact with the beauty as a lover? Or is it just, wow, she knows how to do magic with eyeshadow that'll increase my attractiveness. I'm going to pay very close attention to that. I think it's the same with young men paying a lot of attention to bodybuilders, athletes, but also like within the domain of science, the sort of worship of any particular figures you consider to be a genius. You hone in on those traits you want to cultivate. And that doesn't necessarily mean like I wanted to fuck Darwin just because
Okay, so I have a delicious blueberry smoothie here. I gotta run, guys.